Thank you, Sierra. It is a pleasure to be here today as we talk about scaling evidence-based products and programs within districts. We know that there's now national momentum around the science of reading, and there's really a spotlight on these evidence-based literacy instructional strategies. Often, though, districts find that adopting an off-the-shelf product or program may not meet their context-specific needs. And so, our panel today is going to talk a little bit about those things and about ways that they can adopt, adapt, and scale evidence-based products or programs within the district to best serve their students and their teachers. And so, I have the pleasure of introducing our panel today. I am going to share their bios with you in the chat so you can take a deeper look, but I start by introducing Victoria Armstrong, who's been an educator for 35 years, serving in a variety of roles. She's led an underperforming elementary school to a distinguished school status, and she's currently the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction in Dinuba Unified School District in California, just for a little while more before she retires. I also have with us today Alix Gallagher. She's the Director of Strategic Partnerships for PACE, where she leads research partnerships with California education partners and core districts. Alix also leads PACE partnership with Teach AI, engaging with how artificial intelligence affects education and what state and district policymakers could do in this emerging arena. Arlene Sullivan is an experienced literacy specialist currently working at AIM Institute. Her work at AIM revolves around developing teacher and leader knowledge of evidence-based literacy instruction so all students learn to read. And our moderator for today, Vanessa Coleman, is the co-director of SRI's Center for Education Research and Innovation and is a seasoned qualitative researcher, a systems capacity building designer, and provider, and a strategic advisor for organizational change management. And so Vanessa designs equity-focused frameworks to inform organizational structures, systems, processes, and practices, and will be our moderator today. And so without further ado, am going to pass it over to Vanessa to talk a little bit more about our session for today.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, welcome to today's webinar on scaling evidence-based products and programs within districts, part of the GLR Learning Tuesdays. Again, my name is Vanessa Coleman. I am the director of the Center for Education Research and Innovation at SRI. And I'm happy to be your moderator today. I'm also happy to represent SRI's Leveraging Evidence to Accelerate Recovery nationwide, the LEARN Network, funded by the Institute of Education Services, IES, which aims to promote learning growth by increasing the use of evidence-based products. So as you've already kind of heard some framing for this, over the past few years, there's been significant shift in literacy instruction driven by the science of reading. Right? This movement is grounded in decades of research from cognitive science, neuroscience, and educational psychology, which collectively offer a robust understanding of how children learn to read. The focus on using evidence-based literacy instruction has never been more pronounced. And this heightened attention comes in response to several key issues. One, reading proficiency levels, right? Despite various efforts, reading proficiency levels among students, particularly those from economically disadvantaged and marginalized backgrounds, remain a concern. Similarly, with literacy outcomes, there are persistent disparities in literacy outcomes across different student populations. And then there's this quality of instruction. The quality of instruction, of literacy instruction in particular, varies widely across schools and districts. There is pressing need to ensure that all teachers have access to the high quality research-based professional development and instructional resources needed. So as we delve into today's discussion, it's important to recognize that adapting evidence-based practices is not just about selecting the right curriculum and resources. It's about understanding the unique context of each school and district and tailoring interventions to meet the specific needs of students and teachers. Some key points to frame our conversation and to keep in mind is that context matters. Each district has a unique context shaped by its community, resources, and challenges. We should also consider the question of fidelity and adaptation. Implementing evidence-based practices with fidelity is crucial to achieving desired outcomes. However, this does not mean rigidly adhering to one-size-fits-all approach. Broad engagement. Successful adoption and scaling of evidence-based practices depends on the active involvement of all interested groups, including educators, parents, community members, and policy members. And I'll talk about just a little bit about data-driven decision-making. Using data to inform instructional decisions is essential for assessing student progress and adjusting practices as needed. Districts must build robust data systems and develop the capacity of educators to use data effectively. So today's panel will explore these themes in depth, providing valuable insights into how we can improve educational outcomes for all students by scaling evidence-based practices. I'm excited about our esteemed panelists who bring a wealth of expertise and experience and knowledge. So let's begin with our first question. Vicki, can you share about the work that you're doing in Dyneema Unified School District and how you've approached scaling of evidence-based practices?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be here with you today on a topic that is so important. So first, a little bit about us. We are a small district in Central Valley of California. You can see where we are. We have about 81% of our students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, and about a third of our students are English learners. And within that context, we also need to improve our literacy outcomes for our students. And so we've worked really hard on a model where we first pilot things with coach support. So we research and find the evidence-based practices, and then we make sure that we pilot starting at a very small scale, and we're looking at student evidence and talking with the teachers and the participants who are piloting for us before we scale. And then we're very deliberate in our scaling efforts. As we get that successful evidence and decide what we want to scale, we intentionally work to kind of share that with the rest of our teaching teams so that they're actually seeing the results, the promising results that we've had in our pilots, and that helps them be ready to also join in with us. It helps the scale efforts. We really feel like coaching is important for being able to scale and also for depth. So in our school district, even as small as we are, we have a site literacy coach at every elementary site, and we have district coaches that are supporting our efforts.
Thank you, Vicki. Alex, Vicki talked about the role of coaches in depth and scaling. Can you talk more about the work that you do at PACE to support the development of this depth across districts and how state level policy can support this?
Yes. First, just again, it's my pleasure as well to be here today talking about something that is really critical. I would say just having been in education for now almost 30 years, I feel like the big issue that we grapple with is how to get really strong evidence-based ideas and tested practices implemented well in all of our districts. We know what would help kids. And the work that PACE does is to really try to sit in between policy and practice and bring research-based evidence to bear whether it's the work through which I know Vicky, where we're supporting an organization called California Education Partners that Dinuba has worked with over many years at this point in time, that works to help districts focus on a particular problem of practice over several years and develop their own internal processes for piloting and ultimately scaling, or whether it's working to bring evidence about how that works or those particular problems of practice to greater public awareness for policymakers in the state of California.
Thank you, Alex. So, Vicky and Alex, as you started doing this work, how did you think about alignment and cohesion?
So
Alex, would you mind starting?
Oh, I was going to let Vicky, why don't you go and then I can step back and talk more broadly.
oh, that'd be great. So for us, as we're looking in California, we're adding a new grade level. We've had a certain number of 4-year-olds who turn 5 in a grade we call transitional kindergarten, which would be like preschool in most places. We are now going to universal TK or transitional kindergarten, which means that all 4-year-olds, and we've been phasing it in over the last several years, will be in school in our public TK-12 system now. And so with that in mind, that alignment from preschool through transitional kindergarten through kindergarten and up to 3rd grade was really critical to have that work well in our system so that kinder teachers weren't repeating what was already done, but instead building on what was established with our TK and our preschool classes, so that real vision for coherence across the system and how each grade lays the foundation for the next step has been a big focus for us. One of the areas we really wanted to look at in terms of literacy was phonemic awareness, and then phonics after that. So phonemic awareness was an area we looked at first for coherence, and we actually started a pilot with a TK teacher with an evidence-based curriculum. We tried Heggerty. We had gotten some good information and seen some good results in other places. And so we asked one TK teacher to pilot that for us, and we progress monitored. We have an improvement team, and that improvement team watched to see what those results were. And so we were looking at elements of phonemic awareness and seeing on pre-tests and post-tests and kind of in between how students were doing, but we were also looking at writing samples and seeing what students were doing in their writing and how it was improving and how they were applying those skills even with beginning early literacy. And from that pilot, we knew we were onto something, and that began kind of the scaling efforts that we did. And so that's part of also the coherent journey. We knew we needed something to start with. And then once we saw what it could do in TK, we knew it needed to build out into that K1 and to a lesser degree, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. 3rd more as an intervention. So I'll stop there and see, Alex, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would just say that part of the support I know Dinuba and other districts had in this work and in figuring out how, as TK came into all the districts in California, how to make sure it's really beneficial, is an organization called California Education Partners that has an ongoing research partnership with PACE. And through that, we collect data and do a lot of analysis to help California Education Partners refine its own strategy for supporting districts and really doing a couple roles that are relevant to this. One is highlighting research-based practices, connecting them to experts in the field to help districts in the process of sorting through the vast quantities of information and many different options that are available. To help districts choose one that are really grounded in evidence, and then helping districts understand how to go from an initial trial and really how to simultaneously build educators' capacity and their support for interventions once the pilots help districts figure out how to get those interventions or programs to really work well in their systems and local context.
Thank you both. I appreciate the focus on piloting, right, curriculum with clarity, focusing on things like phonemic awareness, right? That's the kind of clarity that helps you identify what's important. And being clear, right, about your indicators of progress. What are the signs along the way that things are working? And Alex, I heard you talk about this use of data to identify needs of focus, right? And then once you have that data and you've considered and analyzed it, what might scaling look like? How do you support that scaling? It's an intentional process. Thank you both for that. Arlene, I'd like to turn to you as we focus on implementing evidence-based practices as intended. Having this idea of implementation with fidelity. Can you share a little bit about the work you do at AIM and how you make sure that evidence-based practices are implemented as intended and working for your students?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation, because I really take it from the teacher level up. And as we look at this, I love what we're talking about around educator capacity and building that, because that's really where we're at. That's what AIM focuses on. And we really do dive into sort of this fundamental belief that like building teacher and leader capacity is the key for lasting literacy change, right? We want to improve student literacy outcomes, but we have to do that through building the background knowledge that everyone has. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. So I work for AIM Institute for Learning and Research, and we create programs that build teacher knowledge from the base, but ultimately my work as an integrated literacy facilitator is to make sure that administrators and teachers sort of know the evidence-based practices. And then, right, we all know what it looks like in like an ideal world, right? Which, correct me if I'm wrong, but have any of you ever taught in an ideal world, right? Like we know what it looks like in this ideal space. Our real space here is to connect what we know the evidence says works, and also what we know post-COVID classrooms look like, right? Like, how do we connect this piece? What are those evidence-based practices? What do they look like in real classrooms? And then the key that we find a lot with teachers, and true with many students, is they have to understand the why. Like, why are we doing this? Why is this working? So we do work in this learn, practice, apply model to our work when we are building out basic background knowledge for teachers in this evidence-based practice for literacy practices. We want our students, or we want our teachers to learn the background knowledge necessary in order to practice this in a controlled space where they're getting feedback from facilitators such as myself. That's what I do now. And then they're applying it to their classrooms where they're working in real time with their students, because you know, Vanessa, you know as well as I do that like we can practice and apply all we want to that perfect space, and it will never be what actually happens when that student, for whatever reason, is not available for learning that day, right? So we practice this a lot, and we move through this learn, practice, apply cycle when we teach our teachers how to teach reading and how to teach that literacy, that basic fundamentals. And we also work with building leaders to be able to identify the practices that should be implemented with fidelity. We talk a lot about curriculum being implemented with fidelity, absolutely. But we also want to look at the teacher practices that are supposed to be implemented. And we want the leaders to come into the classroom with more than just a checklist of like, oh, you said the buzzword rigor, got it, you're done. That's not what we want. We pride ourselves in being able to build that not only teacher capacity, but also leader capacity. So they have the background knowledge. So when they're looking at their amazing teachers doing the work that they are doing every day, they're able to see, oh yeah, you are following evidence-based practices. Great. I can see you need support in XYZ, and I have the background knowledge to support you in that. That's ultimately our goal with this learn, practice, apply model, is we want teachers and leaders to understand what those evidence-based practices are, but also then how are we going to apply it for our specific students? Because you talked about in the beginning, we can have all the curriculums in the world, we can have the best curriculums in the world, but we have to have knowledgeable teachers and knowledgeable administrators putting that to the paces, putting it to work. So that's what we do at AIM, and I'm very proud to be a part of that work as we move through it. So yeah, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak on that.
Thank you, Arlene. Vicki, Arlene talked about the importance of building the capacity and effectiveness of principals. How have you done this work in your district?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. We've created a set of systems and processes that are predictable for our administrators and our site coaches, where we use those opportunities for building capacity and building a common understanding of what we're working on. And they're really kind of in three buckets. So we have a set of learning walks that we do together where myself or another instructional director from our curriculum and instruction team walks classrooms with site principals, and we're actually walking classrooms to see the new piece of literacy instruction that we're working on, so that they can understand what they're seeing, be calibrated to what they are expecting to see. And also I'm getting real-time data on how the shift is proceeding in the classroom. We usually have some kind of Google form that we're collecting that on, and then that's informing the coach team and myself what the next steps might be for support. We look at that data in the aggregate. We also have several times a year something we call literacy leadership chats, where we combine the coaches with the principals, and we actually create a shared learning experience for the principals that is building that knowledge in whatever we're working on. So this year, for instance, we're working kind of in two areas that we wanted to grow the knowledge of the principals. One was around what TK is going to look like as our kids are getting younger and younger, because we will have some 4-year-olds that will just have turned 4. That's very, very different from having 4-year-olds that are close to turning 5. So that was part of the shared learning. The other piece was around the phonics curriculum and instruction. So what was the approach we were taking? How did it fit into the whole picture of comprehensive literacy? So that they would build that knowledge, and then we do the learning walks to learn about it. So those are a couple of the really important pieces in our system that support us all going in the same direction together.
Thank you for that. Vicki and Arlene, what evidence are you looking at as you assess the implementation of evidence-based practices?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Arlene, follow.
I'm happy to take this. I love to get on my soapbox about the importance of assessment, so let's dive in. So one thing we talk about a lot in our courses is sort of like the need for appropriate assessment within the classroom. You know, we talk about things like benchmark assessments, informing MTSS. We talk about frequent informal assessments to inform daily instruction. Essentially, we want and expect our teachers to be able to answer questions like, how do you know your instruction is working? Like, you wanted to teach this, is it working? How do you know? And show me, right? What is that piece, that show me piece? So we're constantly looking at data. We're looking at that diagnostic prescriptive approach to instruction. And so we can wax all day about that's happening at the teacher level. We want that, but we also want that at every level. So for the leaders, We want the leaders to be assessing, okay, we have this huge implementation piece. We are trying to scale these evidence-based literacy practices. How do you know it's working? What are you doing to make sure it's working? How do you know, and how are you supporting your teachers? And so one thing that we have noticed as we go through this work and as AIM goes through this work, we've worked with dozens of states on this. It is really important for that sort of non-evaluative support and feedback for teachers. Just like our students need corrective feedback that is outside of their state testing, that is outside of their Friday spelling test, that's outside of the assessments that they have. Our teachers need the same, that sort of targeted non-evaluative corrective feedback is sort of a core component in diagnostic prescriptive literacy. And we want to make sure that as we are implementing these huge pieces, we're not forgetting about that seemingly minor piece, but it's really important, right? Implementing evidence-based literacy practice is absolutely a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not a one and done situation. It's not thinking about it for the first 6 months and then hoping that it works for the next 6 years, right? So it does require supportive, knowledgeable administrators who are trained in those evidence-based practices. And it also requires knowledgeable teachers so we can implement this initiative, whatever evidence-based initiative that we're working with fidelity, and able to really target what our students need and the growth that ultimately as a district we want. That's my opinion. What do you think? What do you think, Vicki?
So I agree with everything you said, and I'll kind of take it into two areas. One being at the system level, at the district level, when I'm looking at that area, I need a three-legged stool of data. So I need achievement data on students. That'll be the benchmark or state assessments. I also need observational data. That's going to be from the learning walks, and that's going to help me see what's happening, how the shifts are occurring, how well are we implementing, what are the struggle points, and that's all in the name of supporting, like Arlene is talking, because if I'm not out seeing, I can't really know when I get those student achievement data if it reflects what we wanted to have implemented. And third is really the perceptual data from our teachers. So from the teachers, I want to know what's working well for you if we're starting something new. What are you finding challenging? What resources do you need? How can we be helpful to you? So it's a set of questions that we're kind of asking either through surveys or informally. I like to visit their classrooms in the fall when they're starting something new and just check in. How's it working? What's working well? What's challenging? What support do you need? On the teacher end, I think it's about the formative versus the summative. And at the formative level, it's about empowering our teachers to know how to look at student work or a little formative progress monitoring assessments, and then make shifts in the moment or actually the next day, whichever way it is. At the teacher team level with PLCs, I like them to be able to look at maybe a progress monitoring assessment and a piece of writing and analyze as a team, what are we noticing that they have and what do they need next? So we want to work on building capacity to be very skilled in that area. And we want to also have people looking at their benchmark and their end of year results. I think, like you said, it's all needed. It is a marathon to build that kind of capacity and knowledge. I think it also requires a belief in our educators that when we empower them with the right processes and tools and why something's important, people will use them to the benefit of the students in the classroom. So that's where I think I would come down around assessment.
That is great. Thank you both for that. My takeaways there are about implementing not just with fidelity, but within context. And also this clarity that you all initiate about why you're doing something and how you're going to do it, and differentiating between the roles, right? The administrative roles around supporting and creating the climate and the conditions for that support, but also for the teachers, what is the practical work that they have to do? I hear you all talking about a few things that we all use and talk about, but how do we leverage them in this kind of work? And one is continuous improvement, right? And continuous improvement allows us to build in and define those indicators of success real time, right? And within kind of context of role and timing as well. And I also hear you all talking about the importance of non-evaluative kind of data and feedback. And that's a wonderful tool, strategy that continuous improvement provides us with, right? What are those indicators of progress and success? What do they look like when you're trying something, when you're implementing it within context? How do you learn from that? How do you determine which data you're going to use, learn from that data, and then make decisions and choices before it becomes more summative, right, and formal and final? And the last thing I hear you talking about is the importance of adult learning theory, right? Keeping in mind, how do you really support adults in building practices, shifting behaviors, building their capacity, right? And providing that intentional training and kind of learning community. So thank you both for that. I'd like to switch to engaging diverse interest holders. And this question will be for everyone, so please jump in. What is the importance of engaging diverse interest holders in the work of adopting and scaling evidence-based practices? How can district leaders foster and ensure engagement?
I'm happy to start this conversation off. I have a lot of opinions on it, so I'm happy to dive in. But I know that the others have some ideas as well. I do think that it's such an important question because when we talk about any sort of initiative like this, when we're talking about scaling, we're talking about involving more than just the teachers, more than just one level of the educational scope. And so if we want lasting literacy change, we do have to expect that the whole district is invested. We do have to note and think that this is not just for the teachers. This is not just also to check a box. We're seeing in this day and age a lot of states passing legislation that requires certain education or certain boxes to be checked, etc., whatever. But we see a lot of districts, at least in my work, going through the motions of we checked the box. We trained the teachers, right? We gave them what they needed. But you know as well as I do, everyone on this call, that it's not a one and done situation. It's never like, well, I told you that saturated fat was not good, so never eat it again, right? Like that's never how things work. So there is a space to really dive in and to need full alignment from the top down and then from the bottom up. So we need building administrators to understand, for example, like why scheduling is so important, why it's so important that we put high quality curricula into these teachers' hands, but also give them the power to say, this doesn't work for my students, but I have the teacher knowledge because I've been trained to implement the appropriate change for my students. I think it's really important that when we talk about fidelity with curricula, that it's not like it said the cat is running, that I said the cat is running, that I worked it for my students because I had the teacher knowledge to do that. And I think that there is a space when we're talking about evidence-based and scaling that evidence-based practice to really trusting, like, I know, Vicky, you were talking about earlier, like trusting the teacher to really implement this work. That is so important, especially when we're talking about district-wide work. Change is funded from the top down, but change is sustained from the teachers who are trained and involved and supported from the bottom up. And it is really important that they understand the why is this happening and what can we do to make sure that my students are making the growth that I need them to for this work. So I think it is really important as we engage everyone, we think about, okay, we have to involve the teachers, we have to involve the stakeholders, we have to involve the administrators. They have to understand why the teachers are fighting for more time for intervention, why the stakeholders are like, why does this cost so much? Because teacher knowledge matters. We have to understand from all perspectives. And I think as we engage everyone in this work, it becomes then a work of heart, and then everyone understands more than just the numbers, more than just the students that we're looking at. So yeah, Alix, what do you think?
I agree again with everything you've said. One of the things we've really seen with the Ed Partners model as it has evolved over time based on, them looking to see how the work is progressing in districts is that they've gotten more and more clear about the importance of a cross-functional team working anytime there's a new innovation coming into the system, because as you're saying, it's the teachers sitting around a table who understand what it looks like to try this in their classroom, what their learning needs are, what resources they need, what time. Often time is one of the biggest resources that teachers need in order to make sense of things, to try them, to collaborate, to improve their practice. But they often don't have, as teachers, don't have the kind of authority within systems to do things like get a sub so that teachers can take turns being in each other's classrooms or whatever that is. They don't have the authority to get on the board agenda so that the people doing the work can present the emerging data to the school board and get the school board's engagement and the broader community's awareness in the work they're doing. And so it's having the various voices around the table, creating structures and processes that are formal within districts for information to flow across role types, across schools. Those things are really key to taking any innovation into a system, piloting it, and making sure that the innovation in a local context achieves the potential that the evidence shows it has elsewhere.
I'd love to add on to that. We did learn a lot from Ed Partners and being involved in the collaborations, just like Alix said, about the importance of that improvement team, the group that's shepherding the new innovation in the district being, cross role. So, or as Arlene said, it might be funded from the top down, but it happens from the bottom up. And so our improvement team for early literacy, which is our P3 through 3rd grade team that we're working on every year, we're taking a different slice that we're kind of layering into our system for literacy. We meet monthly, and that team actually is comprised of teachers, an intervention teacher, district level leadership such as myself, district level leadership from the Student Services SPED department, principals, so that it's across the whole system, because we each bring our unique lens to the work, and you need all those voices to actually not have false starts. So not only do you need to start small in order to avoid false starts and kind of work out the bugs and make sure something's worked before you scale, you've also got to have the voices from the different groups saying what are the practicalities that have to be attended to for something to be successful. And when that team meets monthly, we're looking at maybe PDSA data together if we're piloting something. We're looking actually at benchmark data. We're talking about what we're hearing. We have coaches on this team as well. So it's coaches, it's intervention teachers, it's regular teachers, it's district level leadership, and it's site principals. And that mix is that, I think it's almost a secret sauce, because you're ensuring equity of voice within the district itself to get the innovation moved through the system effectively. It's a critical piece to address.
And if I could just add one thing, looking at the chat, there have been a few questions raised about kind of connecting to parents in the community. And, one of the tools that is often used for that is doing empathy interviews, which is essentially reaching out to particular folks who are experiencing whatever the new innovation is, or who are in a pre-innovation state, trying to understand how people are experiencing school, how families are experiencing and kids are experiencing school, and using that information to make decisions like, which innovation should we consider trying? How is it going? How are kids experiencing this thing we think is great? Is it great for them too? What are families thinking about it? And so, I think as we think about what it looks like to have all of the voices around the table, whether it's kind of in very thoughtfully selected empathy interview formats, or by sharing information in community spaces, in open houses, in the board meetings, it's really, really important both that not only that families hear from schools about what those schools are doing, but the schools and districts create mechanisms to hear from the families they serve about the experiences and whether whatever the innovation is improving experiences for those families.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because when we started with our early literacy work, we did empathy interviews of students and of parents, and we will do focus groups as well as another way to get that input we need. So we were holding focus groups this spring around our EL master plan, just as an example. That's not so much an innovation, but it is a way that we're getting the voice, where we're not just giving and transmitting information to the community, but we're actually gathering it, and it's informing what we're doing in a strategic way.
Yes, thank you all for that. And thank you for Alex addressing that big question about broader engagement of students and families. So big takeaway for this, I hear, are things like whole district or cross-system engagement. Oftentimes in some of the work we do, right, we initiate a process like this by kind of mapping roles and mapping perspectives. Who do we need to be involved? How do we make sure that there's buy-in, both for support, for sign-off, but also for to figure out what are key areas of influence and locus of control for influencing and implementing a change more fully. I hear you all talking about leveraging and respecting teacher knowledge and making sure that teachers are put in a position where they can actually do that. If we're taking to this point around empathy processes, right? Building into the process opportunities for families and students to respond and lend voice and provide perspective, right? Hopefully we're using that in an empathy mapping kind of a way, right? Where we're really trying to understand what people think, students and families, trying to understand how they feel when they're experiencing something, right? We're really engaging on a real empathy mapping process. There's also likely an opportunity to rethink who we think are our change and implementation teams are, right? We can build in the empathy to make sure we get broad perspective, but what might it look like to redefine who's at the table from the beginning? What might it look like to build in parent voice, right? What does that, what kinds of adjustments do we have to make, right? And I think that those are the big questions and considerations for this kind of work done effectively. And you all are asking yourselves these important questions. We'll shift to our last kind of big topic before we open it up for Q&A. Let's talk about, and again, this one is for everyone, supports. What supports from researchers, policymakers, and other intermediary organizations could help states and districts to successfully scale and use evidence-based practices?
Oh gosh, I don't know how I feel about being the first person to jump in here. I tend to lean on others' expertise, but I wonder if one thing that might be helpful, there's one slide that we haven't shared yet that I think in kind of is when I'm thinking about this work of scaling is the framework we have. And I don't know if I don't think I can put it up. Well, that's one.
Slide
Hold on.
I think
Vicky?
it's slide 14.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you for that number. This is a slide that's created by California Education Partners and they use in their work with district improvement teams as a way of thinking about what a system is and how to move from having kind of idiosyncratic excellent practices, which every school and every district already has idiosyncratic excellent practices. How do you create a system that gets the consistency of strong practice that's necessary to really help all students sustain positive growth year to year? And they have kind of simplified it down to 4 real pillars or fundamentals of work that are interconnected and actually create a system that can support improvement. And it starts with having teachers and administrators have a really common vision for what students should be doing in each class and what that learning trajectory looks over time. And that should be mapped to the grade level expectations of the state standards with understanding of what rigor looks like. What does it mean to really fully achieve to standard? And how do we get all students to a place where they are achieving those standards? The second is the idea of what the high leverage instructional practices are, often having instructional materials. These are typically the evidence-based innovations that districts are bringing in and getting really clear on what elements of those innovations are what some folks call the tights, the things that everyone must do in order to really do the practice appropriately, to live out the research-based theories that are embedded in whatever the curriculum is. And what are the things about that practice that could vary teacher by teacher as teachers have their own way of implementing, or as one particular context has some set of affordances and another has a different set of affordances? What are the things that can be varied based on local context and individuals? And what are the things that within the system everyone needs to do to really make this innovation work as planned? Connected to that, there's this idea that Vicky talked about very well of monitoring the system, and I really appreciate her 3-legged stool, partially because that 3-legged stool really drives the 4th fundamental around having a robust system to build teacher and administrative capacity. And I'll say a couple things about that last one because there's a lot of research that shows that school districts spend a pretty reasonable level of resources on what they call teacher professional development and don't get very much for it. And that's because I think those, a lot of things that are called teacher professional development, and I'll certainly say a lot of what I sat through as a teacher myself, really didn't think about what it takes to not just learn new knowledge that's kind of static, but instead learn a new practice, and the need for people to be exposed to what that new practice looks like when done well and to understand why. What's the difference between my practice right now and the practice that would be better for my students? How will my students benefit if I make this shift? and then have opportunities to practice that, to get feedback on it, and to reflect on it. Ideally in collaboration, both with my peers, where grade level peers, department peers, but also someone who can provide me coaching, feedback, demonstrations of what it looks like in my classroom to really support teachers to make shifts. And I know often in the media, we hear people sometimes complaining about teachers who don't want to make change. And I think it would be really wise to understand that we throw lots of different innovations at teachers. We ask them to change faster than they can change well without the supports they need to change well. And so long as we keep doing that, it's actually rational as a teacher to resist change until you know that it will help your students and you have the supports to do it well. And so it's really important for folks out there who are thinking about what it takes like to scale a practice to really understand that teachers need to be supported. And we often don't do enough to give them opportunities for practice, to respect that sometimes when you're trying something substantially new, it won't go well. And we have to acknowledge that it not going well, some number of initial times out is expected. And that's why there are supports it should be embedded into teachers' jobs to help them get successful in that change. And it looked like, Arlene, you had some thoughts on that as well, or Vicky?
I have a ton of thoughts, but I would like to first give you a standing ovation for what you just said, because I absolutely agree. But Vicky, what do you have to say about this? And then I'll share my thoughts.
It is critical to develop a system where the types of professional learning that you facilitate and create for educators is based on what research says about how adults learn, and provides those supports, understands that coaching has to be part of it, understands that it needs to be job embedded, and so that it needs to take place in classrooms. And I know, I'll be a little vulnerable here. When I was new in the curriculum and instruction world, I think we probably wasted some funds at the beginning because we did some nice one-day quality training, but there was no plan for how to deepen, sustain, support over time. So that was a learning that we had that, it didn't really make it into the classrooms, because without a plan for either lesson study, lesson lab, coaching cycles, support from PLCs, without this comprehensive approach, which is a system you develop in a district, 95% won't be implemented. Only, the way to say that, and this is classic research, only about 5% of what is learned in a professional development will be implemented absent having that sustained support over time. So one of the best things that we can do for school districts is build the capacity for the leaders to understand adult learning theory, what effective professional development looks like, implementation science, and continuous improvement. When they have a framework of those principles as leaders, and then you can apply it to your specific context, then you have the opportunity to create sustained learning over time, and really to witness the kinds of conversations that happen with teachers and the growth of students. That is a joy as an educator, to see that happen when it's structured the right way for that to happen. So that, Arlene, I'll hand it back to you.
Oh, it's so beautiful, because when we talk about this, it hurts to think about, right, Vicky, to your point, that you probably spent and wasted money on like one day PDs. And I myself as a teacher have sat through many PDs that were probably wasted. I was not understanding the why, so Alix, you talked earlier about like diving into the why teachers are taking this, why it is so important, and building that capacity from the bottom up. I do think that there's a real piece when we talk about this sustainable change. it is really important that we consider this idea that it's not just us, it's not just like you can talk to me all day. I'm happy to get on my soapbox all day about how important this topic is, right? But ultimately, I'm not making district level decisions. I'm not making the change across the board because it involves so many more people than just me. And building that teacher capacity, building that administrator capacity is so important, right? So my company has worked with thousands of teachers and across the board, across many states, across many different demographics. And ultimately, when we ask like, okay, what worked, what didn't, et cetera, when we survey our teachers, because data is so important, ultimately the biggest concern is that like, I'm going to get this training and then I'm done. And then the support is gone. And where do I go from here? I now know what works, but I also know that my curriculum doesn't support it or my schedule doesn't support it. We see this especially with our older students, but like when the schedule doesn't support it, there's no time for intervention or there's no support for intervention. We can see a lot of barriers to that and it's hard to support that shift that's needed if every level is not in support of that shift that's needed. And so that implementation plan. So Alix, you talked about it a little bit. I think AIM has a very similar message, which was kind of funny. I wish we had two slides. I wish we had one comparing your slide and our slides because I think it's very similar. We talk about a lot like we need aligned curriculum. Absolutely. We need MTSS to support all levels of our students. We need ongoing professional development for our teachers. And then we also need aligned assessments and systems to support our students and our teachers as well. So I was laughing a little bit when you showed that slide because I wish that at that moment I could have just popped in a slide too for AIM because I think it's very similar. We can see the similar needs across the realm and I hope that through conversations like this, we become a little bit more aligned in helping create that systemic change that we need so all students can learn to read.
Mhm. There are definite themes here throughout these topics, but alignment and coherence is definitely a major and consistent one. So thank you all for responding to those questions. We'd like to open it up now for some Q&A and some related discussion. We've got some questions that have already been in the chat, some for a little while. I think we talked about some of the family and the student engagement, but there was also a related question about community allies and how important they are to school and classrooms. And how do you bring them and their support, their capacity into this work around change? Anyone want to take that?
I, with all humility, I'm going to say that I don't work in that area as much. I work so much more closely with our principals and teachers. So I can speak a little to what has happened in our district, but I'm not going to be the best example. So I'll share a few where I feel like we shine with it is actually in the 9-12 area with our academies and our pathways, and the involvement we have with industry partners in supporting our Med Academy and our Construction Management Academy and our Skills USA. So at the high school level, I feel like we're surrounded by a lot of community partners that are lifting up the work. Our kids get a lot of job-based learning as part of their academies and pathways. At the elementary level right now, I think what Alix said, we've done where we solicit the input through the empathy interviews and the focus groups as we're working on a change. So that's where I intersect with it. And then, of course, we have our other instructional director who works with parents with the DLAC and the LCAP plan. And so sometimes I will join that. But in terms of the campaign for grade level reading and involving our parents more than just the empathy interviews and the focus groups, we haven't done that. That would be the next, I think, frontier in the journey for our district, you know, to be perfectly transparent with this group. So, and I am open to ideas on that.
Any others have thoughts about the broader community engagement in some of this work around shifting practice and leveraging evidence-based practices or scaling them?
The only other one thing, Vanessa, I would add to that is, you know, so a little nudge for people on this would be Hattie's research. So actually, you know, parent impact on student learning is, you know, it's not low and it's not a negative impact, but it's not as high as other things. So we've really engaged in like the collective efficacy within our school district and our teaching community, because that has a 1.57 effect size versus the effect size for parent involvement, I think, and I'm not going to get the number right, but it's somewhere around a 0.4 something. So I just want to kind of say that while there is a role for it,
Yeah.
if you make that the primary driver, it's not the primary driver to improve literacy outcomes for students. It's not the primary driver to get the campaign for grade level reading within the schools. It has a role, especially in those early, like what we could do 0 to 4. Absolutely, it has a role. And I think our district, Dinuba, we need to get in and work that end of things for sure. But once in the school system, the role is lesser in that it's not the primary driver. It can't be the primary driver. So that, and I know not everyone will agree with that, but I just have to put that out there to the group. Because I can see people would spin wheels in the wrong direction. You need to get the teaching community moving with evidence-based practices and high quality evidence-based materials to make the impact that you need.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. And I can imagine that there are multi-pronged strategies, right, that we can use to kind of more broadly include voices in this work. In this context around classroom and evidence-based practices, right, in terms of instructional and curriculum, I hear you. I hear you, Vicki. And I can imagine that there are all kinds of ways in which we could more broadly include community as a part of ensuring that students have opportunities to practice literacy based concepts when they are doing the business of living, right? So we can all think about that. I think someone shared a potential resource in the chat. Okay, there's another question about how, if at all, do you expect, particularly probably for you, Vicki, the process for how you are going about some of this shifting and influencing of practices, how might you expect that to change with the expiration of ESSER dollars and making those kinds of decisions and choices? What considerations will be made similarly or differently?
Oh, I love that question. So one of the things I feel like we've been very good at over the years in our district is valuing the role of coaching and backing that up with the funding. So I've been fortunate to have a superintendent who understands how important that is. So it never gets put on the cutting block. So we keep our district and our site coaches intact, even when we're hitting the ESSER crunch. And instead we look at other things like, are there computer applications that during COVID crept into the system and through program evaluation, we don't need those anymore and those can be removed. Can we scale back on this because we've got duplicative communication devices for families? Is there one that we're finding that's working better and we don't need 2 or 3? So we're analyzing our dollars in different ways to still hold on to what is critical, which is the coaching. And then in terms of outside contracts for support, we have our literacy work can be supported pretty much internally. We've built enough capacity within that literacy team and through the work with Ed Partners over the year. We've been lucky enough to be in collaborations with them for 11 years. So the knowledge of how to do the work within our system, we've had a chance to grow that. And so we are able to kind of preserve and still go about. We're still going to have an improvement team next year. And that improvement team is still going to look at, okay, what's the next layer in our system for literacy that we want to support? And I don't know if you want to put up that slide of the grade 8 just to show people the grade 8 comprehensive literacy slide, if we could show that briefly. Yeah, thank you for that. So we've been concentrating the last couple of years in that area we call the word work, which is the phonemic awareness and phonics. And actually we're piloting some work with morphology for our 3rd through 6th graders. But then our next area that we'll be looking at will be writing and some shared reading. So what comprehension things of the reading rope do we want to work on during shared reading? And what writing pieces do we want to work on through shared reading? That doesn't take ESSER money, but it does take a strategic plan over time. And so that's why I had to show that. So if you have a guiding vision and you've created the system of how that learning is going to take, the money ebbing and flowing is not hurting us too much at this point yet. And California also is going to face some budget cuts, to be honest. So we've got that coming our way in addition to ESSER funds. But I think it's saying if we know coaching is important, we're going to keep that. If we know we need someone that is going to guide curriculum and instruction and understands improvement science, we're not going to cut that. We're going to look at other areas of the system to cut versus those as we make those hard choices. I hope that helps a little, Vanessa, with that question.
Most definitely. This issue of the loss of ESSER funds in particular, and then their local context funding shifts that we all see is big. Do others have thoughts about that?
So I think from a teacher training perspective, we often see that with ESSER funds or No Child Left Behind, like whatever has come around, whatever legislation is here, we tend to have a whole bunch of money in the beginning, and so we put it towards this first step. But to Vicky's point, that coaching piece, that next step of like, okay, I know the teachers know, the administrators know, we need to shift the schedule, like whatever the shift is, it's really important then to bring it back around and say, okay, it was important enough that we invested a significant portion in year 1. Now we're going to continue to invest in our teachers moving forward, which I think sometimes is lost. So yeah, what do you got, Alix, on that?
Yeah, I just think it's the past 5 or so years have been a really, really tricky time for folks managing school budgets because there are these huge needs and huge amounts of one-time funding. And, we know that the types of changes we've been talking about don't happen in a year if we're really trying to help, get a school district in a place where there's, consistent and coherent adoption and implementation of really effective practices. That's a multi-year journey. And so I think it takes a high degree of strategic fund management almost, with folks who are saying like, how do we chart a steady course for our educators so that they have the time to build skills. And it's been made more complicated by the fact that educational leadership is not necessarily, it's a high turnover job, and that's only gotten worse. I think one of the things, Vicky, you mentioned your superintendent and kind of the long tenure that Dinuba has had, and the steady leadership at the top. That's not something that can be, engineered overnight. Obviously, it's just not the context in many places. But when we talk about this one-time funding, without that stability, it is really, really hard to lead ongoing improvement in a district. And while one-time funds, definitely there were increased needs to be addressed, the just cycles of funding are really challenging to handle from a leadership perspective.
Thank you for that. Okay, let's take another question. How do we help educators at all levels shift their focus from relying on instructional materials to relying on improved practices?
I'll take one part of that, which is to say, when I've done studies prior to coming to PACE that looked at professional development that was focused on theory and kind of understanding what those instructional practices are, and aligned instructional materials that help teachers figure out how to implement those highly effective instructional practices. And I don't know that it's an either or. I think it's more about an intentional pairing of understanding, we came out of a period of time, I hope we're mostly out, where we're telling teachers, please just follow the script, and understanding that might raise the floor, but it has a very, very low ceiling. And we need to think instead about making sure that teachers understand the how and the why. How would this approach work? Here are some instructional materials that can support you in implementing them. And thinking of those two things together as ways of coming into the classroom. And again, connecting to what are the standards we're trying to get students to, what are the practices that teachers can be using, and then what are the instructional materials that support that. And I'll go back to one more piece, which is, we think a lot, and especially teacher preparation programs are typically staffed by folks who are doing research on particular instructional approaches. And that's a good thing. We need that research. And I think some folks come out of those with a belief that particular instructional practices are the best way to teach. And there are really important, instructional practices that are better than others. And teachers need to learn to look at those assessment data to figure out, even if this is a highly effective practice, am I doing it well enough so that it's making a difference for my kids and my students are having the learning that we're trying to get at? And if not, it's almost like that should trigger a feedback loop. Go back to go. Do I need additional help in doing this practice well? Do I need to be using my instructional resources better? Or for some reason, is this practice that has worked elsewhere not working? And going back into that ongoing improvement cycle is just part of, that's part of why teachers need time. There's a lot of decision-making and thought that needs to go into really high quality and consistent instruction. And it has to be in collaboration, and it takes a lot of time. But I don't think it's an either or to get, in a more concise answer. It's not instructional practices or curricular materials. It's curricular materials to support high quality instructional practices.
Thank you, Alix.
Yeah, I
Anyone
love how
else?
you said that, Alix, because, and that's been our approach. People need to understand why we're doing something and how it works. So you need to have the theory, because then you can use it flexibly if you have a depth of knowledge, but you then need the partner of high quality materials to do that work. And you need the opportunity to practice it in applied settings with your peers. You need that opportunity with a coach, with your grade level peers through a lesson lab. So I really love how you said that it's a pair. It's not an either or. And you're right. When we tried that back in I believe it was in the early 2000s, and it did set a really low ceiling for people. And if you were to go into classrooms, and it was not the teacher's faults, it was, if it was imposed that way as this top down, do it just this way, then when you went into the rooms, it looked very robotic. It was very low level, and it actually wasn't meeting the kids' needs. And that's not what the teachers wanted. I think that didn't feel good to them. They knew that. So to realize that it's an and, not an or, I think is really critical for the districts and county offices, organizations.
Thank you for adding that. Arlene, did you want to say anything else, or you look like you came off of mute?
Well, I do have a lot to add to this, but I will just add one point, because this is a place that's near and dear to my heart. But I think to add to Vicky's point, and particularly to add on to Alik's point, like, teachers don't want to just read a script. They don't want you to just give something to them and not trust their professionalism and not trust the knowledge that they have, and not know that they love and want their students to do the best that they can. And by creating this dichotomy that's, you know, sort of arbitrary, of like teacher knowledge or high quality curriculum, that's not the game. That's not what we're playing at. We want it to be a married situation. We want our teachers to have the deep knowledge that they need in order to implement the high quality curriculum to the best of their ability for the angels they have in front of them in this moment, for the students that showed up for that day, right? And so that's, I think that flexibility here is really important, and you have to have a deep well of teacher knowledge, and you have to have a strong, high quality curriculum in order for your teachers to work their magic. So I'm going to get off. I'm going to mute myself now.
Appreciate that. Respecting teachers as professionals, right? And giving them what they need. There's another question that I'd like to ask that was shared in the chat. I might ask Marie Kovar to add a little bit of clarifying points to this. But Marie asks, after a pilot that has gone well and produced positive evidence of working, how can a smaller entity engage further with districts as a whole to expand and scale them as a partner? How might this entity engage more deeply and be taken seriously by a district? Marie, I believe you're coming from a support organization perspective, but please clarify for us. Or if others have a way of understanding the question, please go ahead and respond if you've got some ideas. No.
In listening to Marie's question, I know when we have partnerships with county office people, what, for an example, or a consultant that's working with our district, what matters to us a lot is that it feels very interactive, that we're not getting, we always say that instead of somebody from the outside bringing their canned thing into our system, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but we want to layer it in so that it fits the Dinuba way. So we want it to be very interactive. We want to co-plan with you anything that's coming into our system. We want to be able to tell you, this is where we're at right now. This is where we think the next step is, but we need support getting there. So when it feels very collaborative with the outside group, that's been really successful to us. And we've had long-term partnerships with people in that situation where we've got one consultant we've worked with now for the full 12 years I've been here. And that's because She understands our system, and we work to make sure that the approach that we're getting, while it might be based on the principles over the organization, it is customized and differentiated to meet our specific context. So that would be my only advice for that question, I think.
Thank you. Okay. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Please let me know if my timing is off and that's not correct. There's a question: sometimes school districts seem closed to the opportunity for collaboration and prefer to keep things in-house. How do we introduce our model to school leaders and gain partnership to scale our work with more school districts? And this is from Mark. Mark has a model. Would like to use it to support school districts. Any thoughts or advice from Mark?
Unfortunately, I think to some extent, as I'm understanding the question, that's a question of marketing and how you start to build the relationships necessary to kind of get in the door, and making sure that you understand the needs and can speak to the needs that districts and communities have, I would imagine is critical to that. But I don't, in my role, I look more at district perspectives. And so I unfortunately, I can't help with that. And I'm really sorry. I think it's a question that folks with really good ideas that they know have made a difference for students often have. So it's a great question.
Great question. Probably a question that's similar around that product developers are considering, right? How do we make sure that people understand that we have a product, it's useful, maybe there's data to support the usefulness of it, and how do we then get people excited about adopting it? All right. Do we have time for one more then? Not sure if we do. Do we? Sure. All right. Okay. Just going back to the question about parent and family involvement. If parent community involvement is less impactful after a child enters the educational system, why is that? It's one kind of question for consideration. Your thoughts would be appreciated. If it's because the parents or the community are not as involved, or are they not equipped to be impactful in the educational context for children over 5 and 6 years old? Just trying to understand why there is a loss of impact after a parent, family, or community has been a significant and primary influencer before a child enters the school system.
I think when I spoke to that, it's really more about what's within our locus of control. So our ability, what we have more direct control and influence over is what we do in the four walls of the classrooms and what we do to support those classrooms. In terms of supporting parents outside of the classroom walls, that's a secondary piece. And so it's going to vary so much. You want to be welcoming. I know when I was a principal, we did, morning flag salute in the morning with announcements outside on the blacktop, and it became a ritual for the community, and the parents joined us there. They were out on the blacktop greeting the kids too, listening to the announcements. The kids got to have jokes read through that they had put in the box. So there are playful ways that you can get parents to feel like they're part of the school community. However, like their influence on education, it all really depends on what their capacity is. If you've got someone working 3 part-time jobs, then what I think what we would ask of them, of that parent to help would be, can you make sure that there's a regular bedtime, and can you make sure that there's a regular meal time? But I can't ask that parent necessarily to learn a lot of literacy, like how to do the read alouds, at home. I might ask them to read with their child, but if they're scrambling with 3 part-time jobs, their ability to do that is impacted. If on the flip side, if their kid's in 4 travel sports and every night they're out till 9 p.m., I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road with parent involvement. So in terms of why they have less impact, it's because we can't, as a school system, a public entity, make everybody, they all have different responsibilities in their lives. We can't make them have a set of circumstances and control that environment so they are able to do the things we might want them to do. And nor would it be fair, because everybody's got so much going on. I think that's why it has to be secondary. Like, you want to create the welcoming environment, you want to seek the input, but you're fighting a lot against a lot of cultural forces in general right now, with how busy the world is for our families, how stretched thin they are. So that's why I say it's not the top priority. It's something that you work on that's a secondary priority as a district level leader.
Thank you, Vicki. It sounds like empathy interviews of parents about their engagement and involvement might be a useful strategy. Arlene, I wonder if you have a thought?
Of course I do, because I never don't have an opinion on these situations. But
Right.
I do think back to even my time in the classroom. Like, I've never met a parent, I've never met a community spokesperson who didn't want the best for every child. I've never met a teacher who didn't want that, parent, etc. And so I think when we talk about scaling evidence-based best practices and we try to implement this, like, I think what's really cool is that we can focus on the student, and we can say, we're investing this money in our teachers, in our administration, in our community, wherever we're at, because we want the best for your child. Just like we know, if we're talking to a parent, we know you want the best for your child. There's no question about that, right? I've never met a parent who's like, actually, I'd like my student to be B level. Thanks for offering, but let's not teach them how to read. I've never met that. And so I think engaging in a system-wide evidence-based practice policy or initiative for literacy is going to ultimately include the parents, ultimately include the community members. But it is, to Vicki's point, it's not going, we didn't start at the parents. We know where we can control. Our locus of control is the district level, down to the administrators, down to the teachers, and that's where we're working from, our locus of control. And that's all I'll say on that. But I think everyone wants our students to read. That's why we're in this webinar for grade level literacy, right?
Thank you. And that is the purpose of the conversation, right? At the end of the day. Thank you all. I know that we're at time. Thank you to the panelists. I'll turn it over to Hillary just to wrap us up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vanessa and Victoria and Elise and Arlene, for all you've shared today. I will say to those of you who left this with still questions, that please join us next Tuesday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Pacific Time, because we will be talking about the transition into kindergarten, about those early years. Our webinar is called The Sturdy Bridge, Ensuring a Seamless Transition into Kindergarten. And although there are several other webinars on this list, I also want to point out the webinar on June 18th, Beyond Parent-Teacher Conferences, Partnerships that Maximize Student Learning. I think as I listened to the questions today, that these are some things that this group may be interested in. And so I want to say just one more time to our panelists and our moderator, thank you so much for your time, effort, and thoughts today, and for all that you shared.
Thank you, everyone.